Now to follow, we will proceed with our plenary number 6 on the same topic, democratizing space data. And the moderator of this plenary will be, or is, Professor Otto Kudelka. He is head of the Institute of Communication Networks and Satellite Communications at the Graz University of Technology in Austria. And he is also IEF Vice President for Technical Activities. Otto, please.
Gracias, Christian. Buenos días, señoras y señores. This is about all my Spanish. Welcome to our session, but I will try to practice a little bit because I will be leaving on Friday, so there's one excursion day tomorrow, and I must say, my first time to Latin America, and I'm enjoying Uruguay very much. So, I would like to introduce our panelists. And I would like to get to the stage Pablo Brenner. He is CEO and founder of Colloquia, a startup company using machine learning technology for enterprise collaboration. He also serves as Chief Innovation Officer at Overactive, a Uruguayan software development company. From 2010 to 2016, Pablo was Vice President of Innovation at Globant, where he led a multidisciplinary team that helped Globant customers define new innovative products and business models. He has more than 25 years experience in the high-tech industry. In 1993, while living in Israel, he co-founded Alvarion, which was the company who built the first Wi-Fi products, and he also graduated from the Technion in Haifa, and he teaches innovation at Orte University in Uruguay. He's also partner at Prosperitas Capital Partners, the first VC fund in Uruguay. Then we have a slight deviation from the original program. Mr. Roger Zhu from Netherlands could not make it, but Jean-Pascal Lefranc kindly accepted to step in. So Jean-Pascal, if I may ask you to come on stage. He was already introduced the other day, but for those who haven't been there, he has a very impressive CV. He graduated from the École Centrale de Paris, and he started his career as science attaché to the French embassy in South Korea. He's joined CNES in 1982, where he occupied various positions at the head office. In 1989, he was appointed technical advisor to Hubert Curien, the French Minister of Research and Technology. In 1994, he became Director of Development of the Aeronautics and Space Sector, and he returned to CNES in 1997 as Strategy Officer and then Deputy Director of International Relations, and he is the Director in charge of coordinating CNES's international relations starting in 2014. So, furthermore, we have our next panelist, Martin Rodriguez de los Santos. Since 2011, he works for Untitled as data center pre-sales consultant and business developer, working on the development of the big data business. He has more than 7 years of experience in Untitled, the largest data telecommunications company in Uruguay, and he's also a teacher at the Catholic University of Uruguay. Last but not least, I mean, we should have turned the order around ladies first. Crystal Wilson, she's Director of Space Applications Program at the Secure World Foundation and has over 10 years of international and domestic space, public policy and management experience. Before joining the Secure World Foundation, she was consultant at Access Partnership, where she worked with international satellite service providers and other leading technology companies on policy issues related to spectrum management, emergency communications, telecommunication standards, orbital debris, and multilateral processes, including representing industry at the Inter-American Telecommunications Commission. she also was serving as project manager at the Tauri Group, a leading aerospace analytics firm, and you have a very impressive CV. So I could carry on for another 15 minutes just to complete it. But I would like to invite now our first panelist, Pablo Brenner. The floor is yours.
Hi, good morning everybody. First I'd like to start with a disclaimer. I'm not a space guy, so I'm just software, big data, and entrepreneur, so probably part of the things I would probably say here are either wrong or obvious to you, but just take it as a view from somebody who comes from the big data space, analyzing space data. I started by saying, okay, who has been enjoying from space data till now? You probably, it's well known in the industry that typically hedge funds were using this data from satellites to take conclusions. If you see, for instance, the TV show Billions, one of a couple of shows away, they said, okay, if you will do like everybody looking at parking lots and try to tell me who is selling more, this is something that is pretty obvious. So basically, big hedge funds, big corporations, and the world governments were just using space data till now because it was quite expensive. Basically, as we said, they would probably, some hedge funds would be analyzing the parking lots to understand, to make a sales forecast. Some cases that are typical is just, I think it was 2006 or something like that somebody predicted Walmart sales very well by just looking at how many people were parking in the parking lots. You could also use that to predict layoffs, knowing that some company is doing some layoffs because you see that the parking lots. So big hedge funds, this information is very valuable for them, and they were using it. Or for instance, this is interesting, they will be using this to measuring oil reserves. So this is an interesting case because they took the pictures from the oil reserves, from the oil tanks, and basically by analyzing the shadow size, they could predict the amount of oil that they have inside. Basically the lid is floating, so since the lid is floating, the shadow basically shows how much oil. So hedge funds were predicting the price of oil, basically looking at that. This is an interesting case as an entrepreneur because just if we go back, looking at parking lots and counting cars, this is pretty obvious. You don't need any intelligence, you don't need to be too smart, but just understanding that by reading the shadows of oil tanks, you have value. This is something that entrepreneurs could be looking at. So that's, or for instance, they use it for forecasting crops production. Once again, just basically by looking at not only visual information but other information, they can see what's the level of chlorophyll that each one of the crops have, and by this they can predict what will be the price of soybeans in the future or something like that. So people were really using this or analyzing ports movement. It's important also to gather all kind of information. Also, governments were using that for urban planning or demand forecasting, or even in many cases, if I wanted to build a shopping center or something like that, I could probably look at satellite pictures and understand and try to define where should I build my next shopping center or my next department store or whatever. I can also see how many construction sites are there. So there's a lot of information that companies have been using for years, basically on that. The problem is that this data was too expensive. So basically only big companies were using that. So now with nano satellites and open data, we are making this space data affordable for everybody and for entrepreneurs. So basically now we can start basically, as we said, democratizing this space so everybody can make use of this information. So if we we add that to our big data capabilities that we have been improving during the last 10 years, so the merge of having the data available and affordable and the capability of having lots of power and big data capabilities can make a lot of opportunities. So the good thing is that we are leveling the playing field now. Basically, before that was very, very, let's say, unfair. Now everybody basically can work on that, and we are reducing the asymmetry of information, which in most of the cases there's a lot of value in asymmetry of information, so this is being reduced. So this is opening a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs. I would say probably if some entrepreneur would have information about the oil tanks, I have imagined that he can measure the shadows, he could make a very good business on that. But there are many other alternatives. So I was thinking about where to look for ideas as entrepreneurs, for entrepreneurs. So one of the things is focus on local problems. Since still we are in the beginning with this open space, open data, so most of the focus is on global problems or on the big cities, on the big countries. So here in Latin America and Uruguay, there's probably not much effort being done on the hedge funds. So basically, we can focus more on local problems. We can focus on specific industries. For instance, here in Uruguay, Argentina, in the region, agro is our main business. So we should look for opportunities in these specific industries. And the other way is the local presence. Being here, understanding here the market can help entrepreneurs just bring ideas from things that are working in other places and bring it to the region. But what about privacy? When I was thinking about that, I said, okay, everything is fine, but privacy is a big problem. You probably heard about GDPR, did you? Okay, so GDPR is the new regulation that it's beginning in 2 days, 25th of May, which is the General Data Protection Rules of the European Community. Basically, fines are huge. It's 4% of revenue. The biggest of 4% of revenue, or $2 million. So it's a lot of money and for big corporations. And the restrictions they are putting on protecting data from customers are very different. For instance, you have to have the capability of telling the customer exactly what data do you have on him. Or you have to have the capability of letting the customer can ask you to erase all the data you have related to him. So these things sounds obvious. Regulators can put them and say this is very easy. It's very hard to do that. Basically, when you are talking about big data, you have tons and tons of information, and it's very difficult to go back and see, okay, let's see what's Pablo Brenner related information and how do I erase it. Now, I was thinking about, so theoretically here in space data, we should do the same thing as digital. But, so basically what we do in digital, we get into more details, we do a data anonymization. But the problem is, so basically what you do, we have lots of information on digital, which sites did you visit, which you didn't, what time. But typically what we do in the digital space is we do a data anonymization. We try to erase all kind of information that can relate a specific data with a specific person. This is, so basically it's, you should, if you have a database of people, you shouldn't have the name and the ID with the content of what they have. They have to have this completely anonymized. The problem is that anonymizing images is much more difficult. Just the card there, you see the green card over there is pretty recognizable. So I can know if I have open data and continuous open data, I can know which day this guy doesn't go to work, basically. Or what time he leaves his house and he gets to work, what time he's come back. Or some things about security, whether he's now at his vacation home in Punta del Este, so I can go and rob his house. So all this information is available. Or even worse, to know that this guy is visiting the hospital. So I know he may have a health problem. So there is a lot of implications that are, we are very aware in the digital space about that. Dealing with that, with images, it becomes in my understanding, probably you have solved it already, and I'm just talking. But I think this is something that is quite difficult to do, and we need to be aware and try to understand how to deal with that. So what we do in the digital space, we do what we call privacy by design. And what do we call privacy by design is you should assume that one day you will, someday or somehow, you will be hacked. So you cannot build a system assuming that you have a completely secure site or whatever. You should be, either you will be hacked from the outside or some employee will use this information. So the information, you should assume that somebody will get the information you have there. So the best thing is, and they could process the image, extract the info, or erase images. So what we typically do in the digital space is not to have any information that is related. So the better thing, it's interesting because till now, the big data, we were always talking about we have plenty of this space, we have plenty of capabilities. So instead of erasing data as we were doing some, let's say, 5-10 years ago, we had the concern that the space was expensive. The disk space and memory space. So what we were doing, we invented all these data warehouses where we just selected which information do we need and erased all what that was unnecessary so we can process in smaller space the data and faster. Now with the big data revolution, we changed this paradigm and said space is infinite. Basically processing power is infinite. So let's keep all the data, and one day we'll probably find some value in that. That's the main premise that we had on big data till now. Now we are getting into a situation where we say, okay, but if I'm exposed, if somebody hacks my system and has this data, so we are back again thinking about if there's data that I'm not going to use it, I better erase it. So this is interesting how we were coming back and forth on this space, and basically, well, if you do keep some originals, what we do is we obscure them. So, for instance, we erase date and time, for instance, so nobody can track. So you say this information is valid, is interesting, but I don't want to be able for somebody to understand when it was, or erase the coordinates. I'm thinking about space data, I'm thinking about these two things. Images, in many cases, if I keep them, let's not keep it with date and time because this could be used for some bad purposes. And also in the other cases, erase the coordinates of what the image that I'm looking at. I know in many cases this goes against the value proposition that people are using. So it's a big issue that we have to take in account. Okay, that was a little of my perspective from the big data into the space data. Thank you.
It's a very interesting talk. We have the poll results available here. The questions were, are you concerned about privacy when talking about space data? And the majority says less than web and apps usage data. So what is your comment to that result?
Yeah, I think that it's a matter of we are not aware. It's a matter of awareness. We are not aware that how bad could be people use the space data. Probably even worse than the digital data. Probably the physical footprint that we have is probably more valuable to some people than the digital footprint. Till now, I was also thinking, just hedge funds could probably know all the information about myself, but I'm not that important. The CIA also, but I don't care because I'm not that important. But once, so the value of people working on my information wasn't really important. Now, if the cost is low, we are exposed.
So there were two questions put in via the IEF app. One, with the GDPR coming into effect on 25th May in the EU, do you foresee a need for a space DPR related to space data?
Yeah, I guess so. Or probably some guidelines for space on GDPR.
Okay. There was another question, just for clarification. What do you mean by not having related data?
Oh, sorry for that. That probably was too quick. But for instance, let me give you an example of what we do in our product. We have a big data artificial intelligence product that basically makes profiles of the employees and trying to use this information to improve the knowledge management and the collaboration in the organizations. So it's important for us to be able to know, to build this profile. To build this profile, we look at which sites do they visit, what do they search in Google. There's a lot of information we look at that. So some things that we do on that. First, we erase all the data that we have. So there's, but some companies were asking us, they said, it's important for us to know what our people are looking for. So they wanted us to keep this data. So this data, we had this data, we erased that, but our customers came and said, this is important for us. So we said, okay, let's keep it. But then what we did is we keep this data completely in a separate database and completely unrelated to the personal data. So we can tell the company what's the profile of a person. We can tell them which sites are the people visiting. We can never connect. We don't have this information. It's interesting. In many cases, people say, "Oh, how do you build this profile? How do you know this about me?" Say, "We don't know. You erase that." So typically, the good thing that it works. But we are very paranoid about using data. So that's what I do. If you need to keep data, keep it somehow unrelated.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Jean-Pascal Lefranc. Please.
Thank you very much, Otto. It's my great pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I would like to start with Jeff Bezos, because I suppose that since he was not able to come here, he gave an interview in Viasat journal, and this interview is quite interesting, and I wanted to share with you the main message of Jeff Bezos, who says that we are living in the day one of the space age. And of course, this is quite an important statement. I would not dare myself to say such a statement, but when it is Jeff Bezos, you will agree with me that it has some power. And in fact, we are living in a period of tremendous changes. The main driver of these changes is probably the digitalizations and the technological progress in general, which allows the barriers to entry in the space activities to lower very much. As said Pablo, in the years before, space was a toy for the very rich people. This is less and less the case today, thanks to the progress into technology. That means that new actors are coming. It is good news, but for the traditional actors, and space agencies are traditional actors, this is also creating some questions. And this is what I would like to briefly explain to you, taking the example that I know most, which is the example of the French Space Agency, CNES. What can we do as a space agency to answer to this complete change of paradigm in space? The answer that we have in CNES is that for each domain of activity that we have, basically we have 5 domains of activities: launchers, observation, telecommunications, science, and defense. For all these 5 domains, we of course undertake traditional programs as we did in the past, but we also try to experience disruptive ideas, to experience new types of programs, new types of partnerships, The idea being that we would like to expand our activities and take stock, of course, of these new actors. So I will take a few examples. In the launchers, for instance, we have the Ariane 6 program, which is the traditional program for launchers in Europe. But we are also developing the Prometheus engine, which has two main objectives. The first one is to reduce the cost by a factor of 10, which is not very traditional in the space activities. A factor of 10 is a big improvement. And the second objective is that this engine could be reusable, of course, because this is clearly now the trend that we see in the new space. And we are also working with our German friends and Japanese friends to technological demonstration of recovery of a first stage. This is an experiment that we are undertaking with in international cooperation. So that's for launchers. For Earth observation, it has been already said many times, there is free access to Copernicus data, that's fine, but free access is, the access is also as much important as free. So if you need to have a quick, reliable, easy access to data, and this is what we are doing in France to develop some platform that allow the users of the Copernicus data to access the data easily, download them, and also this platform gives some tools that allow the processing of the data in order to transform the data into information, because this is, of course, the information which is looked after. We are also developing new partnerships with the industry, and for instance, we are working on a constellation of small satellites that would be able to provide a high-resolution digital terrain model with optical sensors. This is understudy for the time being, but I think it is important to show that in these new ideas, we have to partner with the actors that are bringing the ideas. So the way of financing the projects within the space agencies is probably also going to change because of these new activities. On the telecommunication part, there is this big discussion about the digital divide, access to internet for everybody, everywhere, and so on. And this is still a problem that we face in France. We don't have enough access to internet, to high-rate internet. And we are developing, once again in partnership with the industry and with the Eutelsat operator, a new satellite called a new technology which allows high data rate throughput satellite, and this will give up to 1 terabyte per second for the users, which is a volume of information that is 10 times what is happening now. So this is once again a complete revolution, and once again this is done with the industry. So I will conclude by saying that the main goals of all these activities is rather simple, and it has been very well summarized by Jeff Bezos once again in its interview. The idea is that you have to develop infrastructures. When Jeff Bezos created Amazon, there was already the postal services, there was already the credit cards, there was already the internet. All these are big networks on which he could create something else. For space activities, this is the same. We need to have these infrastructures so that the general public, both the governments, the public sector, but also the private industry and the new entrepreneurs can base their activities on these infrastructures. What do I mean? Copernicus, an infrastructure to give you information on Earth on real time, almost real time, with a lot of revisibility. Galileo, exactly the same. An infrastructure that is available for everybody, open access, free access, and that will allow the entrepreneurs to use the signal and do whatever they wish to do with it. I said already, high-speed internet. This is the same. With space, you can have easy internet access for everybody, everywhere, all the time. One more point, very important. Maybe the most important for Jeff Bezos, at least the decrease of the cost of launchers. Because you have to decrease the cost of access to space if you wish to develop all these infrastructures. And of course, we are trying also to help the new entrepreneurs because they need some money to start. So we have created within GLAC, it has been announced by our president a few days ago, we have created a fund which will help finance the new businesses, the new ideas at the very early stage of their creation, and we will be having this fund ready by the end of this year. So for all these reasons, I think Jeff Bezos is right, and we are living in the day one of the space age, and I'm very glad that I could share this with you, and I'm very glad that you, young people here in the audience, will live this fantastic and exciting period. Thank you very much.
Interesting thoughts that you shared with us. Now, the result of the poll question, what is the key driver for democratizing space data? According to the audience, international regulation is the driver. How would you comment on that?
Well, that's quite interesting because in my opinion, the international regulation doesn't come first because we have to first have some progress in technology and, for instance, lowering the cost of access to space launchers. I think this is very necessary so that you can get the free data policy and the international regulation. But of course, this is a matter of debate. I'm happy to see this result.
Some questions have come in. One is, does Jeff Bezos' prediction indicate that someday space data may become in some way a human right like health, clean water, clean air, etc.? What would be your comment?
Well, we should ask to Jeff Bezos. I have no idea. I think that this is not exactly what he intends to do. He has just a vision, and he's developing this vision. There will be other people that will take care of this part.
And the other question was, who can access the fund for the entrepreneurs?
Well, it is the traditional way of doing things. We are asking some professional to manage the fund, and this professional are very used to analyze the files that are given by the entrepreneurs and to see if business case seems viable, and then they will decide. GLAC is not going to influence on the decision of the who is going to fund what, because certainly not undecided who is going to get the money, because this is reserved to a specialist on this question.
I would like to ask a question myself, taking the liberty of the moderator to do so. At the Space Policy Conference in Brussels in January, a member of the European Parliament in her speech said the European taxpayer is paying the bill for the world's best Earth observation system, Copernicus, but those who make the maximum profit out of that are the very large internet companies in the US, and they don't pay any taxes or hardly any taxes at all. What is your opinion on that?
Well, it is a very serious matter, and it has proven true, obviously. But there are many ways to try to change these factors. I think the worst way to change that would be to stop having the free access and free data policy. Because the free data policy has completely changed our environment. And even if others can profit, can benefit out of it, in any way there will be some indirect effect for us. And I think the idea is that the direct and indirect benefits are much more significant than the drawbacks, because in any case there are always drawbacks, and but of course we have to work very carefully with all the drawbacks in order to try to do that.
I mean, one example might be the American taxpayer has paid the bill for GPS, which has been free. If each of us would have to pay 10 euros or $10 per month in getting access to GPS data to use the navigation system, I'm not so sure how many in this room would be willing to do so. Okay, so...
Yeah, and if I may add, you were referring to the big internet companies, but these big internet companies are also investing in space. See Jeff Bezos, for instance, $1 billion a year is coming back to space in order to develop launchers that ultimately could reduce the access to space. So it's a complicated matter.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and we move on to our next panelist, Martin Rodriguez de los Santos. The word is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation. As Pablo says, also I'm not a specialist. I work as data center pre-sales. First of all, I want to share with you what we are doing in Intel, and then what we can help to the big data problem. Actually, at Intel we had 4 strategic projects. One of them is the submarine cable. We work with partnership with Google. Actually, we can connect Uruguay directly to the North of Americas, and in some minutes then I can show you some details. Another strategic project is our data center. Okay, is a data center that has different certifications, international certification that I will bring details in a few seconds. But actually, I want to show you a brief video. I open here.
El mejor lugar para sus activos digitales. Ubicado en Uruguay, un país con una sólida tradición democrática, seguridad jurídica y estabilidad económica, con una creciente demanda de tecnología que nos obliga a estar siempre a la vanguardia. Una infraestructura integral que cumple con los estándares mundiales más exigentes y se complementa a la perfección con el cable submarino que nos conecta directamente al backbone mundial de Internet y nos permite posicionarnos como líderes tecnológicos de la industria de la información y la comunicación. Bienvenidos al nuevo puerto tecnológico de Uruguay. Bienvenidos al cerebro tecnológico de la región. Antel. Avanzamos juntos.
Okay, our first strategy project is to bring for Uruguayan people internet connections using fiber to the home and LTE connection, wireless connection. This is a really strategy project that could bring to Uruguayan people a very good quality of internet access. The fourth one is a project is building actually is an arena where Antel could be brings some conference, entertainment centers, and could make content generation. Okay. If we were talking about our data center, we launched May and 2016, and we have some international certifications from the ISO 2000s and 27000s, from the Apple Institute in Design and Facility. And also we have some awards from international institutions like Data Center Dynamics as Best Service Provider, as Best Enterprise Data Center, and we have National Energy Efficiency. In this data center we have the big data platform that we were talking about in a few seconds. This international network, as we see in the screen, Uruguay has an untitled connection with other parts of America and also with North America. We are in 3 international networks. They are very important: Nautilus LAN, GlobalNet, and also SAN1, that could connect our country to different parts of South America and the North America. Coming soon, this year, until we have a submarine cable working with Google that can connect Uruguay directly to Rio de Janeiro and Santos in Brazil, and also with Fortaleza, and then to the North America. This is a huge, important topic for Antel, because we can connect different parts of South America and United States directly and bring services for international customers. What kind of services we can provide for our customers? We work with small ones, medium, and corporate customers from Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, and North America. We have 4 different segments. The first one, the complete one, the traditional housing and colocation solutions, private cloud, public cloud, and the big data platform. In the storage segment, we can lease storage. Also, we have backup solutions and network data storage. But the important thing here, we have a data lake where Antel has the opportunity to manage the data that can be add value for our customers. The third one, security. We have different kind of security services like Windows application firewalls, system information and event management. We have our own security operation. And the fourth one, the capacity, the connectivity, we can provide for our customer private connectivity and public, using, for example, internet. And also our data center is multi-carrier. We work with another carriers, international carriers, for example, Orange, AT&T, Level 3, etc. For example, I want to mention what kind of service an international customer can rent us. When I talk for international customer, I am thinking small ones, the big ones, but also the academy, the science customer. We are working, for example, with Clara Network. It's a network that connects all universities here in South America. It's one of our customers. What kind of service actually they rent us? For example, the colocation and private clouds, also security services, but the important thing is the connectivity. They work with our private and public connectivity that can bring one kind of different services. We have a right to the data. Okay, we have a big data platform that our clients, our customers, can use it, and also they can add storage, the data lake, the option storage, and also the connectivity solutions. What kind of services we are offering for our customers? First of all, we are used to offer a platform as a service using Hortonworks platform. This Horton platform has the capability to manipulate large data volumes. We can provide only the storage, but also the compute capacity. And the customer can provide their own data and their own analysis algorithms. The other alternative is to have a data analytics as a service. We work with our own data, but we can work with the customer data and the public data, but we have to be worried about data protection law. It's a huge matter that my colleagues are talking about. In data analytics as a service, we are using different platforms like Spark and MapReduce. Our customers can use the data and the add value solutions by web portals or maybe using APIs. When we have a customer need that, for example, our customer needs some social network solution, for example, using Facebook, using Twitter, LinkedIn, we can work with business partners that have the knowledge to work with us to bring a solution for our customers. Talking about data space data, I took an article from Forbes.com from Bernard Marr. He also wrote about technology, IT, big data solutions, and I think it's really interesting what he says. He says the exciting part of the industry is that much of the data will become for the organizations, but for business is not primarily space based. Okay, for example, agriculture, for example, retail. For example, some examples that Pablo bring us a few minutes ago. I think one of the industry we can do something for them is agriculture. The implications are really huge. Using space data, we can know what factors affect the growth of crops, for example. What factors can detect from space, for example, the exposure to sunlight, for example, the weather, okay, the pest activity, and the agricultural industry can know the conditions to grow. This is, I think, is really needs. And I think this is a personal opinion that companies must, and they are challenged to evolve using the space data. That is the very huge effort that companies has today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving us this interesting insight in the IT landscape here in Uruguay. Now we have the results of the poll. What worries about a big data platform? So by far it's data protection, not very surprisingly to me. What is your comment on that?
Thank you, Udo. I also agree with data protection. I read in a Europe Union article. They say that companies must to be near for the customers and make some really relationships. near relationships, to know what customer needs and what customer worry about data protection. And to do that, we as companies, we must work using, for example, blockchain is a very good solution to data protection. Smart contracts also, but I agree that the really worry today is that.
Thank you very much. I have one question from your slides. What is actually the percentage of already available fiber to the home connections here in Uruguay?
I think it's 70, 80%.
Hello everybody. Thank you for having me here today. I also realize that I have the enviable position of, once again, just like on Monday, standing between you and something very important, which is your coffee break. So I'm pleased to let you know that I really have one topic that I want to focus on today, and I'm actually really happy to go last because I think we're a relatively neutral body. We don't consider ourselves lobbyists. We don't get down into the weeds into really specific national legislation. We are based in the United States, in Colorado and Washington, D.C., but we consider ourselves a very internationally focused organization, as we really feel that many of the policy solutions are going to come from international cooperative governance rather than just from one country. And to give you a sense of really what we do, I like to group our activities into 3. Publications, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but this can be everything from op-eds in the newspaper or in space journals to resources that we provide, to policy position papers and papers at, for instance, the IAC. Events. This is probably where we do most of our work. We host workshops, we host panels, we host side events, anything that we really think will help move the conversation forward. We also support a lot of student and young professional events, is because we feel that that's a really important area. And then outreach, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this in my presentation, but we really feel that everyone in any industry has kind of what their job is and what they focus on. And we have the privilege of being a little bit above that. We're not the government, we're not trying to sell you anything. So we can take a step back and really focus on general topics, on outreach, on education, on the things that we feel really important when it comes to space policy. So moving on to our topic today, data democracy. This is the CS description of what space data democracy can look like, and I think this is a really good way to conceptualize some of the important issues within data democracy, particularly for space data. And we've actually already heard today about several of these areas. But as I said, I want to step back and actually kind of focus on the word democracy itself. And one of the most important implications of the word democracy is that theoretically, everyone gets to participate. And so what does that actually mean when we're talking about space data? And the beauty of this kind of data is that the possibilities for what it can influence, how it can improve a variety of sectors is essentially limitless. There are very few sectors or industries or work or government work that couldn't in some way be improved or made more efficient or simply have better information if they had access to this kind of data. And so I really think one of our biggest challenges is how do we actually take that first step in making sure that everyone who needs or could use this data actually knows that and has a process available for accessing it. So while I think licensing and portals and what space agencies are doing, I think those are all incredibly important issues when it comes to space data democracy. One of the most important for me is who actually knows they need this data and what happens when they realize that it could be of value to them. What happens when they aren't trained in this and don't necessarily know geospatial from anything else? How do they actually go about integrating it into their work? So, awareness and use of Earth observation and other space-derived technologies is increasing, but widespread adoption is actually still somewhat slow. We've seen huge gains in the last few years. We've seen a lot of media coverage. We've seen a lot of really new and innovative, exciting projects, and that's wonderful. But there's still a huge gap between what could be and what is. And so some of the things that I think are really holding that up, and many of them have been addressed in the previous days, a lack of technical knowledge or training. And I think this is actually one of the most important. The vast majority of people go to school and have a job and work on their area, whether it's agriculture or sustainable development or humanitarian work or hedge funds. They aren't trained in how geospatial and other space-derived technologies can actually be valuable. We don't have that sort of cross-sector professional training at the lowest levels in most cases. A focus on traditional areas of application. I actually think this is another area where we sometimes make mistakes. You'll hear a lot of the same examples over and over again, and they're really important examples. Disaster management, agriculture, water, those types of things. But again, the possibilities here are limitless. One of my favorite examples to talk about is actually election programming. And so in a previous career, I actually worked in sustainable development. I worked in East Africa and Afghanistan doing political development, actually. And I was on the ground doing sustainability projects in Afghanistan. I was a space geek even then. And I was perfectly aware that there was data and imagery from space that would have been very valuable in my work. We carried out projects all over the country, many of which I couldn't visit because of the dangerous situations. In some cases, my staff even had difficulty visiting. This is relatively simple geospatial analysis. We're talking about one picture from one place where you could look at it and be like, is the well there or is the well not there? And yet, did I ever incorporate that kind of technology into my work? The answer is no. Because when you have a job, you have limited time, you have limited resources, and even just knowing that it's out there, that's an important step, but it's not the only one. It's the process of how you become educated about what you need to do. So while open data and making the data available is incredibly important, so is how people come to realize how they can actually use it. And so I really think that we can broaden that, how we approach this. Another example I like to talk about is democracy and governance. So I worked in political development. People are often very surprised when I tell them that everyone here would know what election monitoring is. It's done in most countries. In some countries it's particularly important as a way to validate election results or not. At every stage of a project designed to monitor an election, you could use space data, whether it's in the early stages when you're verifying census data and setting boundaries, whether it's figuring out how you're going to get ballots to remote polling places, whether it's on the day of election. In a lot of countries, voting occurs outside, so you can actually verify voter totals to a certain extent using space imagery. Afterwards, those kinds of maps and those kinds of discussions can be absolutely invaluable when you're actually having a conversation about what happened here, where the vote total maps are, as everyone here knows, incredibly useful. That's every single stage of a project that is hardly ever referenced in any presentation about what space data is valuable for. And that's just one example. There are hundreds more. Inertia is another example, and I kind of referenced it a minute ago. We do what we do and we continue to do it. And everybody does that. And so one of the biggest challenges for data democracy is how to change that inertia, how to integrate this into work that people had no idea they need and maybe aren't excited about it. Space gets a bit of a pass because they think it's exciting in and of itself compared to other technologies. But a lot of people just can't be bothered to figure out a technology. How many people do you know who do the most basic things on their very exciting cell phone and never do half of the things that their cell phone is capable of? It's the same. It's the same with data. And so we have to really focus on that process to encourage people to overcome a very natural inertia. Donor and government skepticism. I want to touch on this because I think it's really important as we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Where does the money come from? And does the money understand that this is an important technology that's worth paying for? Even if the data is open, there are costs to using data. There are costs to integrating it into programming and into activities. So no matter how free the actual data is itself, it doesn't actually mean that you can automatically use it. And so not only do you have to educate those who are actually decision makers who will actually be using it, you also have to educate the decision makers who allow those people to work and who pay for those programs, projects, and government budgets. Time and money, I've kind of touched on a little bit. Data integration concerns. Privacy, we had a great presentation earlier about privacy. I would also add another concern is that in many of these fields, when you're applying Earth observation and other data, you're collating it against much more specific data sets. So even if the data begins in an anonymous level, you're potentially erasing that when you're looking at a disease vector in a small village. The data becomes very small very quickly. And so that cross-reference itself can create privacy concerns. And too much data. I don't really believe that there is such a thing as too much data, but I do think it can be confusing, again, when you're starting off into integrating this into your work. What are my options? Where can it go? What kind of data do I need? Who owns that data? Those are difficult questions to answer when you're starting from a very basic place. Sustainable Development Goals in space. So what I want to point out here is sort of reiterating what I said before. The Sustainable Development Goals, I really believe that their purpose is not to actually initiate work on these goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, there's nothing in them that's not being already done. They're built off of the Millennium Development Goals. I think their real value is in how they draw and focus attention on these really important problems and bring in new sectors. So I think they're actually really succeeding already because we are talking about them at almost every space conference that I'm going to for the most part. And I think that in and of itself is the value of the Sustainable Development Goals. But within them, again, space applies to every single one of them. It applies to gender, it applies to peace and justice, it applies to water, it applies to economics, it applies to poverty. Every single goal has a place where space can be valuable, and not just for monitoring the progress of them. We spend a lot of time talking about how space data can be valuable to statistics agencies who are responsible for reporting on these. We need to also spend just as much, if not more time, looking at how they can actually be helpful in the implementation of the goals themselves. So this is what I like to shock people with when it talks about the variety of stakeholders. I could have made this much longer list with a lot more examples and logos, but I want to point out that for any project within sustainable development, or even not in other sectors, these are partnerships. So we're talking about, again, educating people about what needs to be done and how it can be done. You have to speak the language of all of these different organizations. You have to educate them all, and you have to bring them to a place where everyone, at least to a certain extent, agrees about how to use space data and how it can be valuable. So one example that I like to use is what happens when you Google a topic? Because that's what most people are doing. Maybe they read an article, maybe they talk to somebody, hey, maybe I can use this for my work. So what do? We put it on the internet and we try to figure out what happens. And so you probably can't read these very well, so I brought it with me so I can actually read them to you. But I have two examples here, food security and land degradation. Two very commonly cited examples that you can use remote sensing and Earth observation data for. So just going down the list of what pops up when you just simply put in remote sensing food security, the most basic of basic searches. You get a slightly dated NASA video on the topic, okay? You get a special issue of the remote sensing journal with 11 articles. That's pretty useful. You get a description of various monitoring products tools. That's very helpful. You get a technical paper talking about how this has been applied in Africa. You get a space for upcoming training that's actually relevant and happening next month. And you get an older but still informative article. So I'd actually say that that one's pretty good. Land degradation. You get a scholarly article on an assessment that was done in the Mediterranean. It comes up 4 different times on the same page. You get a summary of a study on how Earth observation can be used in assessing in the Sahel. Also comes up multiple times. You get the GEO work program description, which does have some emails attached to it, so potentially you could email one of those people. And you get a general overview from a paper from last year. So I would put that in the not so good list. My point is that it's not our job to go out and fix Google. It's to make sure that the resources that everyone is creating and working on don't just look at the specific information, but really take a step back and say, who might actually be accessing my information? What do they need to know? So it's not just about the technical how, it's about how someone gets to that point. It's just as important, if not more important, in making this data more available and used. These are just a couple of final thoughts on some of the things that I think are particularly important on this specific topic of awareness and understanding from outside sectors. As I just said, more resources that outline the what and the how. And by how, I don't mean the specific technical steps. I think that information generally exists or is in the process of existing. I'm actually talking about saying you have this type of project. Here's the different ways it can be useful. Here are some steps you need to take. Increased collaboration along a wider range of stakeholders. I actually think this is one of the most important things, and I see so much effort on this, so don't consider it a bad thing, but I still think that we need to continue to improve. In the space world, we're very excited about how this data can be used for benefit, and that's huge. But we tend to have a misconception about what the other industries need and what they are even. A common argument that I often have is company X or program X is very excited about what their study or their new algorithm or their new process can do. So they're going to a university somewhere else. That's a great step. Maybe they're going to the UN. But a lot of times you have resources closer to home that can help you operationalize that same technology or that same data set for the same purposes. There's already a sector that works on the Sustainable Development Goals. Doesn't mean that that's the only people that you should work with, but there's a process, especially when it comes to, again, where much, if not all, of the money comes from, that you need to engage with. And so you have to make sure you fully understand the sector. It's just like in business when you have a new client. You have to fully become educated about what that client needs, who they are, how they fit into their larger sector. It's the same when you're talking about sustainable development projects. More support for sector cross-training. I think we can all agree this is a good thing. I'm not entirely sure how to make it more common. I definitely see the trend going in that direction, but I would love to see geospatial, other data information much more integrated into schools worldwide so that we can really understand the power of location, as we often hear it referred to, and we actually talk about it at the level when people are actually learning how to do their job, because that's really the starting point for integrating this information. Better engagement with the media. I actually think this is really important. I think it's something that everybody can have an awareness of. Space is really cool. Media likes to write about space. They like to write about Elon Musk. They like to write about cool Mars rovers. But 3 years later, when it comes to talk about what that Mars rover did and the data, you don't see it nearly as much. And it's even worse for what we do. You see the outputs of this industry in so many articles, but you don't see articles about how to actually use this. And some of it's really quite exciting, or you see it as a one-off, but it's not repeated. I have lots of Google alerts set to my computer, but I had to really set up like 15,000 of them to even start getting what I needed to hear. So as you're doing really interesting work, I really encourage everyone to think about outreach, not just for your own project, but for the good of the industry. Because again, the more awareness there is of the value of it, the better off we'll be in the future. And then finally, don't let the perfect and efficient be the enemy of the good and effective. This is an ongoing thing. I meant what I said earlier, that space and the options for how we can use that data are limitless. There is essentially no end to the different ways that this data can be valuable. So there's no one solution, there's no one perfect way to approach this. And sometimes it's better to move forward with a project, learn what you can from it, and move on, than it is to sit in a room and debate how we can possibly use every single resource in the most possibly efficient way. It's not that those conversations aren't important, but if we get, especially at the higher levels, if we get completely wrapped up in that conversation, then we're not actually putting the data into use. And at the end of the day, I think that's the most important. I also wanted to highlight some new research that's come out recently. This happens to be a friend of mine, but I think a lot of people here will find this very interesting. This was a PhD thesis that she's now published as a book, but it explores open data policies all over the world. And it really, one of the things that I wanted to highlight specifically here is that tension between open data and commercial. And that's something that this research really goes into. What does that mean? What are the benefits of both of them? How can they effectively engage with each other? So if that's a topic that's of interest to you, I would encourage you to take a look at this research. Oh, and the other point was why some agencies share their data and some don't. And I was really impressed with the conclusions of this, which was essentially that agency culture and mission purpose, and if the data is specifically tied to the mission, is much more likely to be shared openly. But data that an agency happens to have, or that isn't quite as central to the mission, is much less likely because, again, every agency, every organization has a cost to sharing data openly for themselves. So that data is much less likely to be available openly. So there were a lot of other more detailed conclusions on that same topic. But as you're looking at open data policies, I thought it had a lot of really good points about very specifically why some data is available and some data isn't. And then finally, this isn't necessarily specifically on data, but it is part of our effort to level the playing field and contribute to the idea that as we add more and more actors, and applications is an area that is, as we've been talking about, growing exponentially, we also do need to talk about this broader topic of policy, of best practices, of on-orbit, good behavior. And so my organization put together a free resource called the Handbook for New Actors in Space, and it essentially covers 3 things. It looks at the international legal framework, it looks at national policies and administration, and responsible space operations. It's a bit of a primer. It's supposed to be relatively high level. It's not going to tell you exactly how to get your commercial licensing or exactly which portal to go to get your data, but it will give you the overall broad landscape that everyone needs to know, but again, hasn't been trained on because this isn't what people go to school for. And there are several in-depth case studies on remote sensing policy and administration. I have several copies out on the table. I have some with me. It's also free for download online. And so that is the end of my presentation.
So thank you very much, Crystal, for this very interesting presentation. The result of the poll question, what is the biggest obstacle for increasing the use of Earth observation data by a wider variety of governments and government sectors? So 83% general unawareness, and also not surprisingly, what would you say?
Well, I'm happy to hear that, since I just spent 10 minutes talking about it. I think this question would vary depending on who you're talking to. So where you are in the industry is really going to have an effect on what your answer is here. I just think it's good to highlight that for a broader audience, the answer is often going to be the first question, or the first answer.
Just looking whether a question has come in. No. Beyond the moving forward chart, what 2 or 3 things do you recommend we do as individuals tomorrow to build advocacy, engagement, and awareness?
So I would highlight a few of the areas. I did mention media, and I actually think that that's really important. I would love to see more of the amazing projects and activities that are happening right now highlighted in more ways than I see. When they are highlighted, it's often within journals on remote sensing or in space news, and that's a good start. But I think it has to be wider than that. And so anything that individuals can do to promote their own project for their own ends, I think serves the greater community as well. Another area I would say is when we look at partnerships, any project that anyone's going to be involved in that's going to involve partnerships. And I would just encourage everyone to think outside the box when they establish those partnerships, because many times the people that really need the data or who can assist, I just think we have to be more creative in that. And so I think that's something to be thinking about as well.
Thank you very much. Just one comment from my side. I was happy to grab this book for the new space actors, and I already started reading. It's really very good. I highly encourage that to give particularly to people you know about who are starting some activities, because with this we can avoid situations that a not negligible number of small satellites have been launched without proper authorization, without ITU frequency coordination, so these things should not happen. So if all of them have read the book, then there shouldn't be any problem anymore. We have run a little bit over time, so again I would like to thank all their panelists for the excellent contributions, and also the audience for taking actively part. And I must say the IF app is very nice with its poll possibilities and with the questions that we can raise this way, which should not prevent us in other instances to use the direct old-fashioned personal communications. Not everything should be done electronically, but particularly when there's not so much time, then it's very helpful. So thank you again, and it's now time for coffee.